internacionales responsables de materia forestal, nuestra fuerza radica en la naturaleza informal y voluntaria de la relación y el compromiso en abordar conjuntamente retos compartidos. Estamos a disposición de los países y de los procesos regionales y globales para responder a sus demandas con el objetivo de reforzar la gestión forestal sostenible, los objetivos de desarrollo del milenio y el desarrollo sostenible de las zonas rurales y de montaña. Solo será posible resolver el reto del cambio climático si somos capaces de conjuntar y conjurar esfuerzos en la sustantiva reducción de emisiones de carbono de origen fósil, a la vez que movilizamos plenamente todas las posibilidades de secuestro de carbono. En ambas partes de la ecuación, pero especialmente en la segunda, los bosques juegan un papel crucial. Desde el anterior Día Forestal, el concepto de REDD+ ha alcanzado un amplio consenso en la comunidad internacional. Los miembros del CPF entendemos REDD+ como una oportunidad real para movilizar el potencial de mitigación de los bosques en los países en vías de desarrollo, a la vez que se reconocen sus servicios ambientales y las condiciones de vida de las poblaciones aledañas en el marco de un desarrollo inclusivo. Paralelamente, las normas para la cuantificación de los flujos de carbono de los bosques y los productos de origen forestal en los países desarrollados, conocido como LULUCF, podrían tener un considerable impacto en la gestión forestal y la movilización de su potencial de mitigación. Tampoco debemos olvidar el rol de los bosques en la adaptación al cambio climático. En demasiados países, la gestión forestal sostenible está dificultada por una insuficiente financiación, ausencia de apoyo político, débil institucionalidad y poca tradición de cooperación intersectorial. El proceso de la Convención Marco de Naciones Unidas de Cambio Climático ha contribuido sustancialmente a avanzar en cuestiones que habían quedado atascadas desde décadas, como el freno de la deforestación y degradación forestal, la preservación de la biodiversidad o el reconocimiento de los servicios ambientales generados por los bosques. En todo caso, una mejora persistente de las tasas de deforestación requiere abordar sus causas subyacentes, como son la pobreza, el crecimiento demográfico o la tenencia y el uso de la tierra. Los bosques son mucho más que carbono. Hemos de recordar en todo momento el gran abanico de servicios que estos nos brindan, la gestión forestal necesaria para asegurarlos y, sobre todo, las poblaciones que dependen de ellos. El futuro de REDD+ depende de su capacidad de integrarse en las políticas nacionales en materia de biodiversidad, energía, uso de la tierra o seguridad alimentaria. Disponemos de excelentes oportunidades, no ya solo para reducir la deforestación, sino incluso para revertirla, sin ni siquiera cambiar las siglas de REDD, porque R también es reversión, como nos muestran numerosos ejemplos en todas las regiones y en todos los continentes. Quisiera recordarles las extraordinarias oportunidades para aumentar la cubierta forestal en los países de clima seco o semiárido, lo que además contribuye a la lucha contra la desertificación, la protección del suelo y la mejora de las condiciones de vida de la población local. México, como país que también dispone de vastas zonas de clima semiárido, podría contribuir con una actuación puente en esta materia. Somos conscientes de que el flujo futuro de REDD+ dependerá de que sus flujos alcancen a las poblaciones locales y a la gestión forestal. La confianza de los donantes e inversores en que REDD+ va a ser capaz de conseguir resultados tangibles es clave. Por ello, debemos prestar mucha atención a su regulación, administración, financiación y verificación independiente. El tema de esta edición es Tiempo para actuar, poniendo de relieve la necesidad de preservar los bosques para las futuras generaciones. Pese a los avances, queda mucho por hacer. Les pedimos a todos ustedes su colaboración para trasladar este mensaje a la sociedad. El momento no puede ser más oportuno en el tránsito entre el Año Internacional de la Biodiversidad, el actual 2010, y el de los bosques, 2011. La orientación de este último se centra en la relación entre los bosques y las personas, como forma de visualizar la amplia gama de servicios y productos que los bosques ofrecen a la sociedad. Les deseo a todos ustedes, en nombre del CPF, del Collaborative Partnership of Forest, una fructífera y enriquecedora jornada como preámbulo a un resultado satisfactorio de esta cumbre, guiada por el compromiso del Gobierno de México y del Secretariado de la Convención Marco de Naciones Unidas para el Cambio Climático. Muchas gracias por su atención. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. National Forest Day has very rapidly become an essential feature of any climate change conference of parties. You could say, I guess now, that if it doesn't have a National Forest Day in it, then it can't be a proper COP. And I think that's a tribute partly to the importance of forestry as part of the climate issue, but it's also a tribute to those organizations and individuals who have brought together this event every year, and in this case, the Mexican government, the Central for International Forest Research, and the Collaborative Partnership on Forests. I think their work deserves enormous praise, and I'm sure this will become a permanent feature of these annual events. As Manuel said, I'm not Chris Huhn. For those who came because they were looking forward to seeing Chris Huhn, I apologize for that. He's been held up because his plane had a technical problem, fortunately, before it had taken off, but he will be arriving in Cancun later this afternoon. But as a representative of a foreign ministry, having this platform at least gives me the chance to observe that actually I think the foreign policy community needs to become more engaged with the issues that we are grappling with over these coming days in Cancun, including the forest issue of mutual trust. If we're not using those things, then we're missing something. And as somebody who's been coming to COPs now for nearly 15 years, I would like to see a much bigger engagement by foreign policy communities around the world. After Copenhagen, there were a lot of people, including people in my own country, who pointed to what happened there and said, look, that just shows that the project to build a global binding legal framework to bring together our collective will, our collective commitment to dealing with climate change, that project is not going to work. Let's do something else, they said. And I think, in a way, the challenge that we face over the next few days is a very simple one, because we have to show that those people were wrong. Actually, there is no alternative to the project to build a global, legally binding framework to harness our collective efforts in response to climate change. Think about it for a moment. Anything which is alternative to it is either less global, less inclusive, in other words, or less serious in the commitments that it contains. How can you justify something which is not inclusive when you're dealing with a problem that affects everybody? And how can you expect to harness the political energies around the world? And if you're dealing with a very serious problem, which it is, how can you expect anybody to believe that you are serious if you're not willing to make binding promises as opposed to weaker forms of promise? I remember before Copenhagen trying to explain to my 84-year-old mother the difference between binding commitments and political commitments. And she interrupted me and she said, I understand it. Political commitments are the kind of commitments that governments only intend to keep if it's convenient for them to keep them. And I think we need to redouble our efforts over the next few days to show what this project is really about. Because there isn't an alternative, and if we pretend that there is, nobody will believe that we are serious. And that's the view of the British government. That's the project that we are going to keep on trying to move forward. And I think, you know, if it gets difficult from time to time, which it will, the response to that is not to try and do something else, it's to keep on redoubling our efforts. We shouldn't be surprised that this is a difficult project. The scale of what we're trying to do and the urgency of what we're trying to do are formidable. I think the good news for the next few days is that it is entirely within our grasp to emerge at the end of this week and say, you know, we are now back on track. I think we have to be honest. There was a discernible, how can I put it, a discernible gap at the end of Copenhagen between the show and the road. And we have to emerge at the end of next week with the show very clearly back on the road. And there is nothing in the political fundamentals surrounding this event that should make that feel an impossible challenge. It's entirely within our grasp to lay down some of the key building blocks that international binding framework is going to have to rest on. We can certainly make progress in designing the mechanisms by which the world and the industrialized, the richest countries are going to support the poorest and most vulnerable countries as they confront the climate change, which is already, and I've seen on my travels around the world, causing enormous difficulty in many countries, and that difficulty is going to increase. If we don't do that, we don't have a credible response to climate change. Building climate resilience into our model for development and supporting that with flows of resources. Building mechanisms to accelerate the flow of low-carbon technologies and climate-resilient technologies around the world, another area where we can make progress. We can make progress on, first of all, on showing that we are beginning to spend in sensible ways the financing that was promised, the so-called fast start financing that was promised in Copenhagen, and that this is going to be the beginning of an enterprise which is going to build to the scale and at the rate that was also promised at Copenhagen, and which Lord Stern has been involved in the ad hoc group on financing in elaborating how we might do it. $100 billion a year of additional finance by 2020, as we increasingly understand. But we can make progress in building confidence in that with the mechanisms we agree here. We can make progress with transparency, so-called MRV. We need to have a transparent system of information management about what we're each doing and how we're each supporting each other. Remember that it's not just governments who have to be convinced that this is a serious exercise, and I think sometimes we tend to be perhaps excessively worried about the implications for sovereignty of having serious transparency mechanisms. There's nothing to fear in serious transparency mechanisms. They're part of building confidence. They're part of making sure that the choices not only that governments make, but that other actors whose decisions matter in the private sector and in other constituencies, that those choices actually achieve the results that they're designed to achieve. You can only have that in a transparent situation. We need, again, to address the question of ambition. Only a few days ago, the International Energy Agency, in its annual World Energy Outlook, pointed out that if we act on the commitments, the mitigation commitments, the emissions commitments that we have made so far, we're going to be falling well short of our 2-degree goal. And so we need, first of all, to find a way of locking the commitments that we've made into the formal UN process, but also in such a way that we can enhance those commitments as we go forward and keep 2 degrees within reach. All of that, in addition, of course, to the question of financing for forest-related activity, so-called REDD+, which this event is about. This is an enormous prize, which is almost within our grasp. I feel we can touch it, and there's absolutely no reason why we can't emerge at the end of the week with a very serious agreement on how REDD+ is going to work, which would be a massive contribution to the global effort on climate change. An agreement that embodies a clear sense of what the goals should be, an agreement that builds confidence that the activities that are going to take place within it will work at the scale that they're applied, but which will also be rapidly scalable, an agreement which builds confidence that we're not going to operate the decision-making about this in the context of the natural habitat that many international bureaucrats seem to inhabit when you look at them from the outside. In other words, bureaucratic silos, but in the real habitats that we're talking about, where people actually live and get their livelihoods from the forest, and where those livelihoods are deeply linked with cultures and traditions and social fabric that is extremely important in this exercise, where there are ecosystem services that go well beyond the question of carbon. And we need to make sure that the instruments that we create here with these mechanisms are mutually reinforcing with all of the other activities at local and national and international level, which are designed to ensure that forests are managed in a way which respect all of those other factors and in mutually reinforcing ways. In other words, we need a rich harvest from Copenhagen that will enable us to say, the show is back on the road for an internationally binding regime. There is nothing more important in that harvest than an agreement on REDD Plus and actually also the other wider land use issues, LULUCF. We have to remember this is an issue, climate change, that affects everybody who is alive today, and an issue where we have no control over the timetable. The timetable is set by the way natural systems respond to the perturbations that we're imposing on it. The only issue of public policy that you can say those two things about, actually. That makes climate change unique. So I think the theme for today is time to act, and I just want to end by repeating that theme. Thank you. Time to act.
This is my third Forest Day. I missed, I think, Forest Day in Poznan for reasons I don't now remember, but of course I regret. We all want an agreement on REDD this week, and two previous speakers have underlined its importance. I want to talk about the use of the resources from REDD. Not only because I hope it's close to being within our grasp, but also because unless you can show something about the wise use of resources, you won't sustain those resources over any period of time. I want to do that from the perspective of what I hope you would agree are the two defining challenges of this century: managing climate change and overcoming poverty. If we fail on one, we will fail on the other. That should be our constant reminder. It's not just about managing climate change. It's about managing climate change in conjunction with and in order to overcome poverty. So when we think about the wise use of resources, those criteria should be very clear to us. And I come to you as somebody who spent a lifetime on development economics and spend as much of my waking hours as I can thinking about development policy. And I want to use some of those examples in what I have to say about spending wisely. So let me argue very strongly that this is a story of development, that the story of the wise use of REDD Plus monies is about development. If we forget that, we will not spend those resources widely. Let me give just a few examples. If you look at Brazil, and it's an oft-quoted statistic, but it is important, they have roughly one head of cattle per hectare. The poor cattle has to look about 100 meters to see a friend. That cannot be an efficient use of land. If that productivity went up, just imagine 2 heads of cattle per hectare. They'd still be pretty indulged with space. In that sense, you'd halve the demand for land from the cattle industry. And you would then have less encroachment on the forest. There could be no clearer example that increasing agricultural productivity decreases the pressure on the forests. The head of agriculture at the World Bank is sitting here in the front row. About 10 years ago, I went with him to the Loess Plateau in China. You look one way, it's green. You look the other way, it's dust. You get more people and more productivity per acre, obviously, out of the land that's reclaimed and looked after, and you reduce your pressure on the forests. So agricultural productivity, agricultural development, conserving land, concerning, crucially, water and energy, is at the heart of this whole process. If you look at access to energy and think of Congo, there you see that a lot of the demand is for fuel, for charcoal, for cooking. If you expand the access to energy from alternative sources, you will reduce the pressure on the forests. So productivity, agricultural productivity, must be at the heart of the story. And we should also remember that development, in this partial sense of agricultural productivity, and mitigation, as I've described in terms of reducing pressure on forests, those are clearly linked. But we should also see that adaptation is linked into it as well. So it's not just mitigation through reduction in deforestation being closely connected with development. It is also that adaptation is closely connected with those things as well. Low-till agriculture gives you, organized in the right way, gives you higher productivity, more robustness to changing climate and water shortages. It releases less carbon. All these things are bound up closely together. If you look at Indonesia and palm oil, which is absolutely at the heart of the deforestation process, there's lots of degraded land in Indonesia. You could do a lot of the palm oil on that degraded land. But how would you do it? Well, this would be a major exercise in land reform. There's nothing more important in development in circumstances than in many circumstances than land reform. There's also not much that's more difficult in development than land reform, but it can be done. I've been working in one village in India now for over 36 years, following it every year, sometimes more often. In that village, which is pretty chaotically governed in many ways, they have had 2 rounds of land consolidation. So it can be done, but it's a major development activity, and it draws very heavily on the quality of governance. So what I wanted to do, drawing on examples from the 3 big, as it were, biggest forest nations in many ways, is to underline the story of development, mitigation, adaptation, particularly in connection with stopping deforestation, being very closely bound together. So this is a story in all those crucial ways of deforestation, but it has to be an integrated story, and it has to support the ambitions to raise living standards. So as we think about convincing people that there's good use that can be made of this red money, we have to be thinking ourselves through all these stories. And it's not something that can just be sliced off and left to just to build a particular carbon market and then get the flows in from that market. That is to misunderstand the problem. That is to miss enormous development opportunities, and it is to risk failure. And if we don't spend the money well, it won't last forever. It wouldn't be renewed. So as we think through this problem, let's constantly focus on those links. Let's make sure that the international support mechanisms that we start to build, whether they be through the multilateral development banks or in some other way, let's make sure that those methods of support don't lock in the separation and the division between the battle against deforestation and the battle for development. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, Indonesia is in the process of change. It started 12 years ago when the previous regime was changed into a more democratic government. In short, we changed from a pretty autocratic country to become a democratic, a very centralized government to become decentralized. And we just realized that actually our deforestation rate is very high. And then we changed our policy in which before we see forestry is more exploitative, to change it and become more protective. So we are in the process of change. Indonesia is a big country. The total area of Indonesia is 5.1 square kilometer. It's an archipelago. So from tip to tip is just the same distance between San Francisco and Boston. The difference is that we have a lot of water. So that's the difference. There are so many islands there. 5, 6 big islands. That makes things a little bit difficult to manage a country like this, vis-a-vis with a land mass. And as I mentioned, that deforestation is very high. And then we realized that we also produce a lot of emission. Forest fire. If there's complaint coming from our neighbor, from Singapore, from Malaysia, because of forest fire, well, that's one of our products as well. But Indonesia has a lot of tropical forest. It's number 3 in the world when it comes to tropical forest, and with very rich biodiversity and people living within the forest. So these are the things that we have in Indonesia. We have a lot of natural resources. We can contribute a lot. At the same time, we realize that we have so many challenges. So 1 year ago, the President made a very important declaration that Indonesia wants to contribute toward the reduction of emission by 26% with our own resources, Indonesia's own resources. This comes from our realization that deforestation is becoming a very problematic challenge in Indonesia. But with the international support, the President announced that we can reach 41%. So this is a very bold announcement coming from the President. And now that becomes our national priority. Everything's come down from that national policy. And then our friend from Norway stepped in and offering us a cooperation. So we are so grateful with the government of Norway because it's the first government among all those governments that's involved in this climate change offering a cooperation with us. And in the month of May, an LOI, a letter of intent, has been signed between our two governments. Ladies and gentlemen, we realize that climate change, deforestation, carbon emission reduction actually requires a total revamp in the way we govern the country. 12 years ago, we left a centralistic government to become a more decentralistic. But when it comes to forest, when it comes to carbon, when it comes to climate change, it is just not a matter of 1 or 2 changes. The whole setup of the government should be restructured. And that is not a very simple way to do. A new paradigm should be put in place. A new way of development should be put in place. Question, can we do that? If you talk about governance reform, people welfare, rule of law, Poverty alleviation, well, actually, there's the whole set of all elements that you can find in any country. Question, how do you do that? Well, I'm an optimist, but we've done before in a much smaller scale, and that's in the province of Aceh. After the tsunami hit that area, well, the tsunami is the biggest natural disaster that we ever had in the modern history. In total, 169,000 people killed or perished in Aceh only. And if you want to add up with more difficult elements there, conflict was there for 25 years, a total devastation, a history of corruption in Indonesia, to put it very bluntly to all of you. Really? He's a very good moderator, okay, so we did that. We've done that. 7.2 billion US dollar, 70% coming from the international community, and we've achieved that. Never before that there's a disbursement of 93%, and that's a trust coming from the international community. So we can say, although we are a country with low integrity when it comes to corruption, but we have achieved that. So the first step of this LOI was put in place, and now we are in the preparation on how to implement things when it comes to REDD+. Please jump to the stages of the preparation. This is what we are doing now. We are preparing everything such that it can be totally implemented next year. And that's to develop the REDD+ national strategy. This is something that we've done, and hopefully that we can achieve by the end of the year. The design of the REDD+ agency is a totally new design for Indonesia. The funding mechanism, MRV, of high integrity, and the most important one, difficult one, a little bit complicated, is about the moratorium. Because we don't start with a clean sheet of paper. There are hundreds already licenses being issued to exploit the forest. We have to deal with hundreds of licenses that has been issued. Well, that's a real challenge for Indonesia, but we can do that. I believe we can do that. This institution necessary for a national REDD program, there should be the MRV, as I mentioned, the REDD+ agency, and the funding mechanism. And this is the 4 key in the pipeline that we are preparing: the national REDD strategy, the suspension of new licenses, pilot province. We already identified 3 pilot provinces. It's now in the hand of the president for him to decide which one to become pilot province, because nationwide it should be implemented after we are confident that everything that we want to put in place is successful in that pilot province. And communication, just like this conference, is very important. So I'd like to thank C4 for organizing this event and inviting me to deliver this presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcelo, and I'm delighted to follow Pak Kuntoro on this panel and to join you all here in Forest Day. It's wonderful to see the energy in this gathering. It's wonderful to see the ideas that you bring to this process and the commitment that you all provide to this agenda. Let's hope that we see in this week all of this lead to a renewed effort and a firm commitment on REDD. It's wonderful also to be here in Quintana Roo, a place where I had the privilege to work in the 1990s. For me today, in many ways, this is a homecoming. But for those venturing here for the first time, I hope you have the opportunity to make a journey to the forest communities of Quintana Roo and elsewhere in Mexico. It will be an eye-opening experience about how we can protect and preserve the world's forests. No country better exemplifies the potential of community forestry to both fight climate change and reduce poverty than Mexico. And it hasn't been the fencing of forests, but giving local communities ownership rights and an opportunity to take responsibility for the sustainable stewardship of those vital resources. Mexico's experience in community forestry, while not perfect or complete, is certainly showing that with the right policies in place, local communities can be outstanding and sustainable stewards of forests. Thousands of communities in this country now own between 60 and 80% of Mexico's forests. This has resulted in an array of successful forestry enterprises that have created tens of thousands of jobs and provided a burst of economic activity. With more than 2,300 community enterprises that harvest timber legally from their forests, and close to 200 community enterprises that have their own sawmills. The vast majority of wood produced in Mexico today comes from community forests. And we heard the President of Mexico point to this fact this morning. Fortunately, more and more, we're seeing Mexico's experience with community forestry replicated elsewhere. In Latin America, forest-dwelling communities own or have long-term management rights over more than 230 million hectares. That's an area larger than all of Mexico. In Guatemala, community-owned forests are bucking a larger and troubling trend of deforestation across the country. In fact, local communities now own or have long-term management agreements for 26% of the forests in developing countries. That's good, but we need to increase the number. After all, local forestry management does more than help local economies in the long run. It is integral in the fight against climate change. This is why it is so important that we come out of these meetings with a renewed focus on not only community forestry, but on REDD+ as a cornerstone of those efforts. It is vital that the nations gathered in Cancun ensure the future of REDD initiatives that respect and promote community stewardship. Doing so will motivate other developing countries with large forest tracts, such as Indonesia and Central American nations, to follow Mexico's lead. The simple truth is that we need to get this right now, because community forests, like rural areas in general, remain under threat. Because as forest carbon becomes more valuable, governments and powerful groups may be less willing to recognize forest dwellers' rights over their resources. Moreover, any REDD agreement negotiated here in Cancun must have adequate safeguards that protect the rights of indigenous people and other forest-dwelling communities, and must explicitly adhere to the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples. It is also important that the agreements include measures to promote agroforestry and natural regeneration. Above all, the ultimate success of REDD is predicated on directing substantial private investment into forest conservation activities. This will require clear land rights and resource tenure. So we can say that one of the new frontiers in the development of REDD will be to link safeguards for indigenous groups and forest-dependent communities to investor principles. Governments that are serious about scaling up REDD must be equally serious about defining and defending land rights. At a time when the struggle against climate change seems more daunting than ever, Mexico's experience with community forestry based on this recognition of land rights shows that we have within our means the ability to turn the tide. The philanthropic sector is committed to supporting this agenda. Just 2 days ago, here in Cancun, we presented a new effort, the Climate and Land Use Alliance, which brings together 4 foundations in a commitment to catalyze the potential of forested and agricultural landscapes to mitigate climate change and deliver economic, social, and ecological benefits. Let's work together to make sure the biggest takeaway from Cancun is a renewed global commitment to preserve and protect the world's forests, all the while ensuring the long-term viability of the communities that call these forests home. It's time to act. Thank you.
Buenas tardes a todos. Me alegro muchísimo de estar aquí hoy representando la industria. I'm very happy to be here today representing the industry that plants forests, working forests, that manages forests and uses wood. So I will bring you a different angle in the interaction between climate change and forests that you might find a bit far from you, but that nevertheless it is close. Our companies have been investing in low carbon technologies and energy efficiencies to reduce their carbon footprint. Between 2002 and 2007, the direct emissions intensity in our sector have declined between 12 and 13 and 16%. In addition, the net sequestration of CO2 into the forest products value chain was 424 million tons of CO2 equivalent, which is enough to offset 86% of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production, with the manufacturing of forest products. We are in the same boat. Our long-term activity depends on forests. The 4th climate assessment report that we heard about this morning, published in 2007, concludes that in the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fiber, or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. According to the climate scientists, forests have to be used in a sustainable way. They are not meant just to lie idle. But this conclusion must be put in the global context that could constrain the forest mitigation solution. In fact, with 9 billion people on Earth in 2050, the global economy will have to deal with scarcities. Land will be needed to supply food and fiber, fuel, housing, livelihood for communities, bio-based products. And data signals already a possible land deficit of some 100 million hectares in 2030 and even 200 million in 2050. The world economy is striving for social responsibility in business models, for solutions to climate change, for sustainable use of natural resources, for expansion in the use of renewable energies, for markets that respect nature, for new ecosystem services that raise the economic value of forests. While the forest products industry model may hold the path to reach those aims, may hold. There's still a long way to that. Our industries release the economical potential in trees by converting wood and fiber into products that meet human needs. And because of the economic value of these goods, these products, forests are replanted by industry for future harvests that will ensure sustainable growth. Now, realizing this potential requires national and regional integrated political approaches that bring consistency between different policies: climate change, forestry, agriculture, rural development, environment, even in energy, even industrial policies. At global level, it requires agreements that take into account diversity while involving all the players and harmonizing mechanisms and instruments that are related to forests. To allow our industries to participate in the solutions that we're talking about also requires to overcome misperceptions about cutting down a tree. The proliferation of slogans calling to save a tree don't make the distinction between deforestation and illegal logging and the harvest of a tree to be used in wood products, which will continue sequestering products. It also calls for a halt in the fight about the definition of sustainable forest management and which forest certification systems proves to be the best. The result of that fight is that today 90% of the world forests are not certified to any forest certification systems. Our energies should be to bring all the world's working forests up to sustainable standards. Our industries have largely put in place systems for procuring fiber and wood that ensure that wood it uses comes from legally and responsible managed forests. Sustainable management of all types of forest is a guarantee of the continued production of trees, wildlife habitat, water shortage and filtration, biodiversity, livelihoods, all things that society needs. Sustainable forest management has to be embedded at the very core of REDD+ to realize the fourth assessment report conclusions. Forest products industries are using an increasingly envied resource and need to do it in the most value-adding way and most efficient way if they want to keep doing business at all in the future. Fractioning the wood in biorefineries, and by that producing renewable products, renewable fuels, green chemicals, high-tech fibers, construction materials, furniture, pulp and paper, all this contributes to decarbonizing the economy and bringing our sector further into the bioeconomy of the future and replacing oil-based products. The energy potential of wood is already a reality. Massive investments in bioenergy, in particularly liquid foods for transports, are currently being done with the help of government incentives that distort markets but also overestimate the biomass potential. This leads, I don't need more, this can lead to over-harvesting. Climate change policies that promote sustainable forest management and add value to sustainable forest products generate jobs and benefit all landscapes. That is what our industry is doing, trying to reconcile business with climate imperatives, and we want to do this in partnership. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, good afternoon. Let me be brief. I will share three things with you. The state of play in the negotiations, a bit about the second, a bit about the dynamics of the negotiation, because the third will be a fearless forecast, but where I will ask you to participate in shaping that result of that fearless forecast. The state of play right now is yesterday we got a new text from the chair of the LCA, Margaret. And Margaret, it's a full text for the whole package, but with as always a part on REDD+. The text combines the previous three options that we have had, and I predict that that will be the final text that we will be negotiating in the next few days. What is old, or what is still in this text from the Copenhagen text? We have the affirmation of the phased approach. We have the affirmation of the scope of REDD+, which is reducing emissions from deforestation, reducing emissions from forest degradation, and then the plus, as you know, is conservation, sustainable management, and enhancement of forest carbon stock. So that's been settled, and that is not going to be revisited. We have the principles and safeguards agreed on earlier in Copenhagen as affirmed. Again, a really big, I think, step forward for all of those who were concerned that human rights, governance, co-benefits like biodiversity would be ignored in this RED agreement. It's the strongest safeguards I've ever seen in a multilateral environmental agreement. The fact that the word safeguards itself was accepted by governments, including developing country governments, without any debate over sovereignty, I think is a really big step forward internationally. One thing new about the safeguards in this new text is that instead of the previous text that says the safeguards will be, its implementation will be monitored and reported, what we now have is an option to that, which is the providing of information with respect to how parties are addressing that safeguards. There were parties that were concerned about giving a legal obligation to monitor and to review safeguards. I prefer, you know, like any negotiator, I prefer my own text, the text that I developed in Copenhagen. But like a good negotiator, we should be ready to abandon such texts to promote agreement. And I think we can strengthen this new option if that's the only option that we have to get agreement. After all, safeguards are not emissions that needs to be monitored, reported, or verified. You know, I mean, compliance monitoring is different from MRV of emissions. Two other new things in this text. Instead of a deforestation, a long-term deforestation goal, what it does is to link RED to a long-term overall goal for emissions reduction, which is in the shared vision part of this new text. In other words, there is no deforestation goal, but whatever we do in RED needs to be linked to the overall emissions reduction goal that will be agreed on by the parties. Right now, there's no quantitative number for that. There's just a 2-degree, you know, a goal to be below 2 degrees, not to increase beyond 2 degrees. Another change in this text is the proposal for dealing with subnational reference levels. What we have here is to accept subnational reference levels as an interim measure and not something to be final. And I think this is a compromise like the long-term goal, which should be acceptable. The remaining elephant in the room is, as you can imagine, finance. Mainly because finance in the overall package is underdeveloped, very far from agreement. And that's why you have 3 options in finance given in this new text. We will have to work on this in the next few days to find agreement. I've actually studied it, and I think agreement is possible. I mean, with hard work, if we focus on the first phase, preparedness. And I think that makes sense. And this too is how I would deal with another elephant in the room, which is markets. As you know, one party is very has been trying to give text that excludes markets, which in turn is unacceptable to many parties. But I've listened to these arguments, and I do not actually think that markets it's the problem. I think the problem or the critique is about commodification of carbon, commodification of forests. And my argument has always been, but nobody is saying that the value of forest is equal to the carbon. In the same way, but we never say that the value of the forest is equal to the timber it produces or the minerals that you extract from it. So I think there's a way around dealing with the markets question with language that actually postpones the rules for that in a latter phase, which makes sense, no? Because I think we now realize, even those that are working on the ground, that a results-based phase for RED will take a while to arrive at. About the dynamics in RED has actually been exceptionally good throughout this whole process. Became more difficult in Bonn after Copenhagen. because there was an opportunity to open things. But by and large, the good thing about RED is that the big climate change countries, both developed and developing, are aligned. They want RED. They never had really serious debates about whether we should have RED or not. There's been no serious north-south debates except on finance, as you can imagine. But sovereignty issues never really have arisen. Development issues have arisen. Like, for example, for conversion to natural forests, that debate over that has never been about sovereignty. It has always been about development and about poverty, which I think is a legitimate debate. So the dynamics have been good. I think the negotiations have been also done in a very inclusive and participatory way, particularly leading to Copenhagen. I certainly follow the best practices of social accountability in that negotiation. Every week in all negotiations weeks, I think 10 weeks of negotiations, I briefed all stakeholders from indigenous peoples to carbon investors to conservation organizations, to environmental activists, what was happening. So not to influence them, but so that they could influence their own negotiators. And that's where I will end. My fearless forecast, and here I take on my academic hat and just sort of studying. I study negotiations also, aside from doing it myself. And my fearless forecast is that we will have an agreement next week, and that will include RED. It will be the most important part of the agreement because it will be the most substantial and the most that can have an impact on the ground right away. I think President Calderon's statement this morning was very important, how committed he is. At the end of the day, we'll have to call a couple of presidents here and there, probably in this hemisphere more than other hemispheres. But you will have to do that. But I think it's doable. But you too have to play your part, which is you have to talk to your negotiators, you have to talk to your ministers, you have to ask them to be flexible. You know, what we have in the RED Plus agreement, even there will still be some negotiation. We do have a week to go. But even what we have now, believe me, it's not perfect, but it is not only good, it is very good. Thank you.
Obrigado, Marcelo. Thank you. It's my pleasure to bring here a regional voice from an Amazon perspective. What I'll do is I'll report the key findings of a meeting which took place last Friday and was a joint venture by C4 and Amazonas Sustainable Foundation. And I'd just like also to take the opportunity to thank Francis, not only for the partnership for that event, but also for your wonderful leadership and the use of soft power, if we could call that way, in bringing all of this together. Congratulations, yeah, Francis. We did a survey similar to what has been done here, and 60% of the people who attended this very interesting meeting think that it's either very important or important to have RED implemented in the Amazon for the future of both conservation and sustainable development. About 2/3 of the participants think that the Amazon is ready for RED, which is very interesting. In terms of obstacles, 4 main obstacles were discussed. First, land tenure, which is mostly unclear. Second, a clear mechanism for benefit sharing, especially that is able to address poverty. Third, the importance of having national and subnational legislation, given the fact that the UNFCCC process is slower than most people would like it to be. And fourth, access to finance. So these were the key obstacles that were discussed. And as far as finance, about 83% of the participants think that we should not be discussing whether it should be market-based finance or public finance. It should be a combination of both sources of funding. In terms of the Latin American landscape, and especially in the Amazon landscape, there are positive notes. There are many initiatives going on. Many initiatives led by governments at both national level and subnational level. There are initiatives led by NGOs. There are initiatives led by business. So the landscape of Latin America is full of very promising initiatives. And that brings us to possibly one of the main messages, is that we should not reinvent the wheel. We should have more South-South exchange of experiences. And on that note, I should also take a note of Minister Kuntoro's visit to the Amazon, which was a wonderful experience to have a South-South exchange. And I'd like to close with an invitation. We're going to put together next year, next September, the second Latin American Symposium on RED. And you're all welcome to join us in Manaus next September. Thank you.